Well, welcome to another talk here. So we're talking today about cross-genre stuff, and the reason I'm talking about cross-genre stuff is I've kind of built a career out of two kinds of cross-genre. One cross-genre is literally crossing a genre line to write something in a zone that's not yours, and the other is melding genres. So we're going to talk a little bit about both. For those who don't know me, I always have to introduce myself. Jonathan Maberry. I'm a New York Times best-selling author in multiple genres, which has helped me build a career. I write horror, science fiction, fantasy, thrillers, mysteries. I edit Weird Tales magazine. I am a scout for the new Weird Tales Presents imprint, which is a Blackstone imprint, which is just launched. In fact, I signed the first contract on Friday. It's a really cool new imprint, and Blackstone is here, so go over and say hello to the folks in Blackstone. They're in the big room. And I love the opportunities, both creatively and in terms of money-making, that are involved in cross-genre. So let's start with that part of it first. Now, one note ahead of that is I am a completely traditional author, but a lot of this stuff will also apply to those who want to expand your creativity and your audience base if you're an indie writer, and it works really well for hybrid. For those who want to break into traditional for some things, but stay indie for others. So some of my references may be traditional, but understand that and we can talk about how that can adapt to you as well. When I broke into fiction, I actually did it from a different genre. I started as a nonfiction writer. I was writing nonfiction articles most of my life. Started when I was studying journalism at Temple University as a kid. And I would write, originally they say write what you know. So I wrote, I've been doing martial arts since I was 6, so I wrote about martial arts, broke into magazine features doing that, expanded on that into other areas, and then once you have a footing in sales, you can then start writing what you want. And my interests range from everything from skydiving to folklore to music to whatever. And I wrote about all of those different things. So even within nonfiction, I was jumping genres a lot. I wasn't sticking to one zone of nonfiction. And what that did, it allowed me not only to constantly find new markets, it increased the number of markets that could be found. So if I stuck with writing for martial arts magazines, even when I was doing it in the mid-'70s when martial arts was like really huge and hot, there were only 6 major martial arts magazines and about 8 small ones. So pretty quickly you could kind of glut that market with articles, and I found that it's true, even to the point where sometimes an editor, even if they liked you, was asking you to either wait a little while or write an article and submit it under a pen name so that they could put multiple articles on the same issue, which I don't like as much because it doesn't help you build your brand, but I did because I'm enough of a mercenary to want the money. But as I expanded my career, I was able to jump from the martial arts markets to all the other different markets. And one example of this in nonfiction, because I know some of you are nonfiction writers, I did an article back a number of years ago. I wanted to do an article on bullying. And instead of just pitching it to the markets related, and it was mostly school bullying originally, I pitched it to parenting magazines and magazines for kids, like Boys Life and so on. But then I also, expanded the idea of what bullying is, and I pitched it to business magazines, women's magazines, because sexual harassment is bullying, magazines that play to different ethnic backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, because racism is bullying, and so on. I wound up taking that same seed of an idea, and I pitched it to about 100 magazines, the idea. Nonfiction, you don't write the article before you pitch it. And I went up, I got a lot of rejections, but I also made 11 sales. 11 out of 100 is not bad in terms of pitching for articles. And, those are anywhere from $1 to $3 a word for 2,000-word articles. So it actually worked out pretty well, and I was able to write in all these different, magazines for different audiences. And that kind of gave me a taste for taking a single idea and finding, or a way of thinking about something, and finding different ways of expressing it based on the market. Like if you want to write for, say, a psychology magazine, and a parent magazine, and a military magazine, and a travel magazine, but they're all roughly on the same topic, you know the readership are going to be different. So you read some of the magazine, you get an idea of what the readership might be, and starting from the same idea, you then tailor it outward to that market, and it allows you to expand the idea. Well, when I switched to fiction, my first novel came out in 2006, Ghost Red Blues. I'm writing my 47th novel now. I'm a high output writer. I write a lot. One of the things that has allowed me to drive my career and make, sell as many books as I have, is the fact that I am not staying completely in one zone, in one lane. If I was writing just, say, weird science thrillers, which is one of my, my main things, the Joe Ledger thriller series, if I just stayed in that lane, my publisher wants to publish one of those a year. And yes, the amount that I get paid on advance is not bad. I mean, better than it was when I first started. But the amount I get paid on one book is not enough for me to live the lifestyle I want in Southern California, which is expensive as hell. So I wanted to write other things. But the publisher at the time only wanted me to write one of those a year, and that was it. So because I could write faster, and because I didn't want to put out a book for another publisher that would compete with that book, my next thing I wrote was a young adult post-apocalyptic adventure, the Rotten Ruin series. So, you had, I think the third Joe Ledger book came out when the first Rotten Ruin book came out, 2 different publishers. The books have completely different audiences. One is 12 to 15-year-old kids, and the other is adults. The books were not in competition. I hit my deadline, so I wasn't pissing off one editor by stalling him while writing something else. I was able to create at that point 2 income streams for my creativity. At the time, 2 books was what I could do. That was my speed. Now I write 4 novels a year, 1 every 3 months, and they tend to be different genres. The last book I wrote was a deep space science fiction novel with aliens versus us. The book before that was the second book in my new epic fantasy trilogy, swords and sorcery sort of thing. Now I'm writing another one of my weird science thrillers. My next book is Lovecraftian and horror, and so on. My agent knows that I want to go in different directions, and she knows, she has me keep her apprised of what I think my comfort zone is for output. Like, if somebody is like I have a buddy, for example, he writes 1 literary thriller every 3 years, and that is his speed. That would drive me up a wall. So I know that probably because I was trained as a journalist, and because I had to work, sometimes as many as 2 day jobs while writing on the side, I learned to write fast, and I also learned to write wherever I could write. I didn't mythologize the process of writing to the point that I needed the right moment. If I had, I started writing before tablets came out, but I would have a notebook with me all the time, or I'd have a little recorder with me all the time and constantly be adding to it. That taught me to write fast and be able to, as soon as I had the opportunity to write, to dive right in, and that increased my output. Now I'm not preaching this as a way of saying you should all become high output writers. But if your output, and a lot of indie writers have this ability to churn out something pretty quickly. I know I've talked to those people who are doing like 5-6 books a month, 5-6 books a year, or even more. That's awesome. I know the tendency is to want to write those books to feed one particular market, especially if you're making sales in that market. I have a friend who writes erotica, and that's what she wants to do. She can turn in an erotica novel, every month and a half. She's banging out one after the other. And that's great. But, sometimes markets get a little soft and income levels drop. And if you don't have plan B locked and loaded, then you're at the mercy of what a crowd does that you have no control over. If a market is getting soft, no amount of your social media push is going to make the market itself firm up again. Markets get soft. It happens. I had friends who used to write action westerns, and then when Louis L'Amour died, the ass fell off the action western market. Guys like William Johnstone and the other people who were writing it these were traditional writers with a huge list of books. We're getting $2,000 advances for mass market paperbacks that would be out and gone almost as fast as a Hallmark novel would be out and gone. Not Hallmark, Harlequin, sorry. So, but if you can write multiple books, and you know that you can contribute at least one solid work to your principal market base, if you have the time to do others, you can not only write more and stuff, more stuff that won't compete with that, but you'll write more things that will build a new audience, and you can work through social media and cross-pollinating that audience. I do that a lot. In fact, after having established my adult thriller series, which is weird science with elements of horror in it, I was doing, and I'd started this post-apocalyptic zombie series for teens. I thought, well, the first book in the thriller series was zombies, medically created zombies, and the post-apocalyptic series has zombies. Why not see if I can cross over a little bit? So one was for adults, one was for teens, but I had a character, the lead character of my adult thriller series. I moved him into the other series. Now that series is set 30 years after the thriller series, so he would be an older man. He's 65 in the post-apocalyptic world. But I added him to the series, and he became a series favorite. It brought over some of the adults who were reading the young adult, reading the thriller series into the teen series. Because I don't write, a good young adult novel, for those of you who write that, you don't write down to kids, you write up to kids. So, they can handle some tougher themes and materials. Having adults in the book that are supporting characters are great. So I brought my lead character and made him a supporting character in another book. As the kids who read that aged out of reading YA, they followed that character over to my adult stuff. So by walking characters around, it allowed me to make my readership one extended readership. And by the way, the way I got the idea to do that, I'd like to take credit for it, but I can't. The first time I met Stephen King, we had a nice long conversation about writing. Now, he had just beaten me to an award for something. We had both been nominated for the Stoker Award in 2007. I won for Novel of the Year, for Best First Novel, and I lost to him for Novel of the Year. So that was the way we started our conversation. And he was asking me what I was going to write, and I told him that I wanted to write a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And he said, A, you definitely should do that. And he said, B, move your characters around. Take your characters, have them do cameos in other books. He's been doing it for years. Sometimes people don't even know when he's doing a cameo because you may not have read the other book. So the placement of the character doesn't require that you've read the other book. But if you had, it's a nice little level of extra fun. It's an Easter egg. It's something kind of cool and new. I love encountering that in fiction. With a lot of my thriller friends, it's kind of a common practice for us to borrow a character and use somebody else's character in a walk-on. In my latest thriller, Relentless, I'm friends with Joe Lansdale, who's a horror writer, mystery writer, and so on. He has two mystery characters, Hap and Leonard, that were a whole series of books and a TV series for a while. I asked if I could just use Hap and Leonard for a cameo. He said, "Oh, give him more of a cameo. Give him a couple scenes." So I did. And then F. Paul Wilson, who writes the Repairman Jack thriller series and a lot of horror stuff, said, "I saw you put Hap and Leonard in your book. Why don't you put Repairman Jack in the next one?" And I'm like, all right, I can do that, And we start doing that sort of thing. So not only do I expand my fan base by moving my characters around, I increase my fan base by using characters belonging to friends with permission, and they borrow my characters sometimes, and again, we all kind of benefit from it. It's a lot of fun. There are also shared worlds where it's intentionally, characters from a lot of, that everybody is playing with, But that's kind of a different thing. A shared world is not really cross-genre. It's just basically a party where we all get paid, and I'm cool with that. But with cross-genre writing, with multi-genre writing, I guess is the fairer way to call it, you also get to experiment with things that you might not ordinarily try. Now, often we do this in short fiction, because short fiction allows for experimentation much more than novel-length fiction, for the obvious reason that, if it goes awry, you haven't written an entire novel that's just going to sink without a sight. But by experimentation, you get to expand your skill set. You find new things that you can do as a writer. So with with a lot of the stories that I like telling, sometimes I'll do a standalone novel so I can explore something a little different than I would do in my regular novels. I pitched to Chris Carter, the guy who created X-Files, a novel about Dana Scully as a teenager, because in the show they allude to the fact that Dana Scully used to believe and then stopped believing, but they never explain why she stopped believing. They also mention a couple episodes that she has mild psychic powers, but they never explore it. In fact, eventually the writers stopped playing on that, and it just faded. And I told Chris I have an idea for a novel. Can I write it? Kind of a thriller with horror tones and other things. And he said, yeah. And I wrote the novel, Devil's Advocate, and it's now the official backstory of Dana Scully, which still freaks me out a little bit, but I'm happy with. And I got my friend Kemi Garcia a gig to write a novel about teenage Fox Mulder. They don't meet, by the way. They meet in the X-Files show, but a standalone novel about him, which again, blended thriller and horror elements, but told a story that was not addressed in the show, and also addressed not only brought the adult readers of the X-Files, but it brought the X-Files to teenagers, which were not part of the demographic, because the show was on in the 90s and early 2000s. The kids who are teenagers now weren't even born then, but now a lot of them got to know that, got to read, they went and watched the show and so on, and it gave me an opportunity to experiment with something that in my standard pitching would not have gone over well with my publisher. So the publisher of my thrillers isn't the one I did it with. I did it with another imprint, but because the book was not thematically the same, it didn't compete. Now, in terms of indie, if you're writing a lot in one genre, sometimes there's a fear that if you start writing something else, the audience won't follow you because they're dedicated to you writing that one theme. And sometimes it is true, but most of the time it is not true. If they are following your writing, they're following your writing. They're following you as the writer of interesting books that they keep going back to. Yes, maybe fewer of that particular audience may follow the other book, but that the new genre you're in and your level of celebrity within the indie world, within the book world, within social media world, will draw new readers in. So you'll create a new blended market of some dedicated readers and some new readers, and you'll have made a footprint in a new genre. With the rise of horror as a genre that is now getting respect, and I'll explain why I mean now, so many people in Hollywood are looking for IPs, intellectual property, a short story, a novel, or whatever. They don't care if it is indie or traditional. They don't give a crap. They want it in print, on audio or ebook. They want a substantial, actual thing. Every time I pitch, I want to pitch a TV series idea to my agent, she says, write a book or a short story, and then we'll pitch it. So that's an intriguing thing. So if there are areas that you think, like idea you have that might be, a good inspiration for a TV show or movie, but it's not your normal lane, do not hesitate. Carve out some time and write it. Get it done. Get it out there. Go on social media, use the hashtags for whatever it is, horror, and there are a lot of subcategories of horror, so it could be ghost horror, splatterpunk, whatever that thing is going to be. Use the hashtags to get it out there. Find the audience, because also there are a lot of people out there working in Hollywood whose job it is to troll social media and look for buzz. And if there starts to get buzz about a new thing, let it be yours. Have your thing out there so it can be seen. You can't get hit by a car if you're not playing in traffic, right? It's a weird analogy, but it actually does work. And it also, again, it allows you to try something really, different. My first three novels was a trilogy of vampire and ghost adventures, in a small town in Pennsylvania. It is even though those books continue to sell well, they have never been optioned. The next things I wrote in different genres are the ones that got optioned. My first bestseller was a media tie-in book. Some of my biggest successes came from trying things that were not my lane. Even though, my first three books, they won awards, Stoker Awards, other things, they got a lot of recognition, yay, still sell. But for some reason, they're not hitting the right note for Hollywood. I did a story about a genetic disease, genetic disorder that creates symptoms that are like vampirism. That became a friggin' Netflix show. But my other one, which was all about classical vampires, the old, good old-fashioned, didn't get picked up. I'm doing a project now under non-disclosure agreement, prequel to a science fiction movie from about 10 years ago. I only kind of half-assed liked the movie. It's not really my genre because it's science fiction with just a little whiff of Christian theology in it, and I'm kind of more in the, I'm not a religious person anymore. But they paid me, they asked me if I would write that. I wrote it. They had me write a sequel. Now they're doing a prequel television show, and I'm going to be an EP on the show. Had I said no, because it's not my lane, I wouldn't be an EP on a show that's going to star one of the stars from Star Wars. So, opportunities are in all different places. They're not necessarily in the direction you think you should be looking. Moving cross-genre, moving into different genres and trying different things is a great idea. Now, one of the, since we're talking about, I mentioned short stories, one of the things I really recommend is test driving different genres in short fiction. It's one of the smartest things to do. Because if you don't like it, you've written a short story. If you don't like it, don't send out the short story. You've wasted, a day or two, most a week. If you do like it, well, that's something you can sell as an independently published short, or you can look for a pay market anthology or magazine to pitch it to, and open up new relationships with editors, new relationships with the other people that in the magazine or anthology. Start creating new audience awareness, because now this is something in an audience that would not have seen your stuff otherwise. And just because, say you might write historical romance, but you decided to do a ghost short story, doesn't mean that those people, some of those people won't come and go look at your other stuff, because people tend to read more than one genre, which is why writers should write more than one. One of the reasons writers should write more than one genre. But those audiences that love your writing will look for more of your writing. And sometimes they will take a risk and read something that isn't in their genre. I do this all the time. If I like something by a writer and I find out that was kind of like a fluke of theirs, I'm still going to go read something else because I like the style in which it's written. It's funny, I'm more dedicated to good writing than I am to specific genre. I will follow a writer for their style, even if it goes into some really oddball places. Well, the worst case scenario, it's stretching me as a reader, and because as a reader, as all of us are as readers, we're also thinking about, the writer is never off the clock, even when we're reading for pleasure. So if I'm reading something outside my zone, the writer in me is looking at that too. And the writer, sometimes to think, would I want to write that? And sometimes the answer is no. Maybe a genre that you think about, would I want to write it? I don't, but I like to read it. But, at least now we've learned something about ourselves by looking at something and considering it as a writer. I want to pause on that note for a second. One of the challenges in writing is we often read in the zone we write, which is good. You should be familiar with your genre. But you shouldn't read only in the zone that you write. I had a librarian when I was a kid. Every time I went into the school library to get a book, she would always make me take 2 other books. And she would pick them for me originally, and they couldn't be in the genre of the book that I picked. When I got to meet and become friends with Ray Bradbury when I was 12, 13, and 14, he would bring me books every time we saw each other. He would bring me science fiction, because that was his, or fantasy, because that was his favorite thing. But he would also bring me historical stuff, romance stuff, comedy books, science fiction, westerns, all sorts of stuff. Because he said it was so important for me as a writer to understand good writing in all of its forms. No matter how I got published and where I got published, if I understood what good writing is and could read good writing and be able to read it as a reader and then read it as a writer, sometimes that's multiple reads, what it does, it gives you an understanding of the kind of the carpentry of the writing, the skills that went into it. And I applied this when I started writing novels. I had never taken a writing course other than newspaper writing and one magazine course. I'd never taken a creative writing course in my life, not once. So when I sat down in my middle 40s to write my first novel, I had no idea how a novel was written, even though I had read so many novels, because I hadn't yet deliberately started reading as a writer. So I got 6 novels that were in the genre I knew my first book was going to be in, which was sometimes known as American Gothic, Suburban Gothic, basically small town horror. Read those 6 books as a reader, and then read them multiple times as a writer, looking for the elements of craft, looking for how, for example, one writer would build a scene leading up to horrific reveal, and another writer would do it. Well, if you read the way Stephen King does it, and Peter Straub did it, and Shirley Jackson did it, and Robert McCammon does it, they're 4 completely different takes, even though they're technically in the same genre. 4 completely different approaches to building suspense, to revealing the horrific moment, to showing the monster, to showing the human effect of having encountered whatever the big bad is in the story. They all did it differently. And one of the problems when you focus on one writer, as your idol, as your kind of unofficial mentor, is you just learn how they do it. And what that leads to is copycat writing, and nobody ever should be a copycat. You should be the best version of you. With horror writers, if we have a successful book, there's often a review that will say, the next Stephen King. Well, flattering as that was intended, I don't want to be the next Stephen King. I would like his income, be fair, but I want to be the me that's writing. I don't want to write my horror novels like he wrote his horror novels. I want to write my horror novels like I write. But the only way to do that is to understand the skills that go into writing. And this is true of every writer, no matter how you're getting published. This is true. We should have not only respect for our own creativity, we should have the respect for the reader to make sure that we are the best craftspeople we can be to turn out the works that are our best at that moment, right? With short stories, we get to refine this. We get to keep taking a topic, writing a story, and then editing it all the way to completion and publication. And then we should reread that story. We should reread everything of ours that is published. Because by reading our final published, edited work, we get to see what that voice sounds like. And that way we can aspire to start the next work at that level. It'll cut out revision levels. It'll cut out a lot of the self-doubt because this thing's already in print. This thing's already selling. I don't care whether it sells 2 copies or 2 million. If somebody is buying that work, that somebody saw value in it, if somebody's leaving a review, they've seen value in its quality. So look at what it is they're reacting to and aspire to that and start there. How many of you have audio books out? Okay, how many of you intend to have audiobooks out? Should be every hand up. Anyway, if you have an audiobook out, listen to your work on audio. Partly because the reader will inflect differently than you intend, which means the reader will be picking up the inflection that is apparent in the way the story is written. A sentence written implies interpretation, implies inflection, that is almost certainly going to be different than your own. So by listening to how it's read, you see how people are hearing it. How when they're reading it, that's closer. The reader's version is closer to the version that person has when they're reading your story. Also, you can't ignore word echoes, bad sentence construction, and other things when listening to it on audio. You hear it all, and it allows you again to hear mistakes that you've made, so you can repair those in the next thing you work on. But it also allows you to hear when your writing voice really sings, when you've gotten into the zone in a story, and it's what you want. And this is the edited final version of it, so you're hearing that voice. So by becoming familiar with that, and with short stories, you get that opportunity more quickly and more often than you do with novels. It gives you a chance to try different genres, make more money, build a bigger fan base, and also, get to become more familiar with your polished, published voice. Okay, so that's multiple genre writing. The other part of this is cross-genre or blended genre. I love blending genres. My Ghost Road Blues books are the first book it's a trilogy. The first book in the trilogy is basically built around the structure of a serial killer thriller, The Hunt for a Serial Killer. Even though it has monsters in it, it's structured as a thriller. The second book in the series is structured as an investigative mystery. And the third book is a kind of a pre-apocalyptic, or trying to prevent the apocalyptic story that is an action-based story. All three stories in the same trilogy, but each in a different style. Because I was test driving different styles, because I didn't want, like in a trilogy, you also have the middle act of a trilogy tends to sag a little bit, because that's where you had a lot of character development and exposition. I didn't want it to sag under the weight of those things. I wanted to give it its own purpose, not just a bridge between the introduction and the big dramatic ending. I wanted to give it its own purpose. And as a result, the first book reads more suspense-like, with an ominous lead up to, is this supernatural or not? The second one is all about the heroes confirming to themselves, it is supernatural, and it's much bigger and badder than we thought. And the third one is trying to figure out how to stop it, because everything they know about monsters, about fighting vampires, came from books and movies, and these aren't those kinds of vampires. So each book is a different kind of horror novel with a different kind of story structure, a different purpose to it within a trilogy. That was fun. It taught me a lot about writing. So it had thriller, mystery, suspense, horror. It had a coming-of-age story. It had a story about child abuse, which it's its own subgenre of the coming-of-age story. There was a love story in there. It had all these different elements to it that were not just put there, they were deliberately put there. I wanted to construct a story that had, if I was going to have a love story in it, I wanted to have a good love story, not one of those that you expect a love story in a horror story. There has to be two people fall in love so they can support each other, or maybe, go through things together and, blah, blah, blah. I didn't want something tagged on. I wanted to use each of these the genres as subgenres in the trilogy, but do them justice. Now, mind you, when I was writing this, I had no idea I was going to sell it. If I couldn't get an agent, I was definitely going to self-publish. But I didn't know what the audience reaction would be. So I was writing the book that I felt I wanted my name on. And if you're not a writer, that kind of sounds egotistical, but if you are a writer, I think you get it. If your name's going to be on it, you know that to some degree you're going to be judged by it. Well, you want to be able to stand proud and say, yeah, I wrote that, I meant that, this is the best writing I could do at the time, and I hope you enjoy it. You don't have to hide behind it, I wanted to be proud of every part of it. And yeah, sure, looking back, it's 16 years ago, it came out in 2006. There are a lot of things, if I could go back in time, because I'm a better writer now than I was then, I would want to change, but I won't. I was even offered the opportunity of revising it for the 10th anniversary edition. I didn't. It was the best book I could do at the time. Moved on. So other books I've done. I did a book that was based on a role-playing game called Deadlands. It is alt history, Western, supernatural, horror, adventure, and in my book I also added undead velociraptors, because why wouldn't I add undead velociraptors? I mean, seriously, if the opportunity is there, And I added an uncredited cameo by a sandworm from Dune, just because I could. Now, it's actually hard to pin where that book should fall in terms of genre, and that's what made me want to write the book. The guy who created the game gave me license to do anything I wanted. So I had a buddy adventure thing. It was almost like this gunslinger and this Lakota Sioux guy become the shared protagonist of the story, and I built that kind of almost like a buddy cop story. I wanted that dynamic back and forth. I wanted them to be able to play with each other, even to a degree, make some implied poking fun at each other's identity, I wanted them also to be smart protagonists. So in a lot of Westerns, you have the kind of guy who, he's from the farm, he's a drover, and he's a nice, decent guy, but he's not that smart, but he's good-natured. I don't want to do that. I wanted actually two smart protagonists. I wanted them to each be smart in their own way for different reasons, and I wanted to build that, and that's a different kind of story. It's more like you see in some of the, the John Sanford mystery series, like the Virgil Flowers and Lucas Davenport, that level of camaraderie. But even though they make fun of each other, they both recognize that they're good at what they do. So I wanted that. I wanted a strong female protagonist with her own storyline. I wanted a villain whose storyline made sense, so I had to deal with that. And I wanted as much action as I could in there. Oh, there's also steampunk elements to it because, I wanted to do steampunk. It was such a weird multi-genre thing. I had so much fun doing that. And by doing it, I kept finding kept coming up with new ideas for ways in future stories to simply erase the genre line that's drawn around a book. When I did my novel Glimpse, standalone novel. The premise, it is technically a vampire novel. It's about a vampire feeds on the last little bit of hope before hope fails and becomes despair. Feeds on that bit of hope. So it's a vampire novel. He's never called a vampire. There are no fangs. He's a different type of vampire. He's also possibly a ghost, possibly a demon, certainly unkillable supernatural being. We don't know why he's doing this, but we know what he gets out of it, but it's still not why he did it. So, there has that element to it. It's also a story about drug addiction and recovery. And I did a lot of research to make that drug addiction and recovery a potent part of the story that, if pulled out, could actually be its own story. Which means I wrote that addiction recovery plotline with what I call self-integrity within fiction, that each plotline justifies its own presence in a story by being as complete, and also by having read enough about addiction. I'm not an addictive personality myself, but it was in my family and friends, so I read and talked to people to make sure that I didn't write it in a cliche way, which not only allowed me to write a more interesting story, because the more you research something, the more facets you see that you can put into the story. There's also an adventure story, and there's also elements of urban fantasy in there. Quite a few elements of urban fantasy, which my editor was not expecting when he contracted me for the book. He thought he was getting a vampire book. Well, surprise. The book did much better as this cross-genre bit of weirdness than had it been a straight vampire novel. Now, I mentioned earlier something about horror, and I know I only have 6.5 minutes left. I mentioned that horror is now getting its, more of its due. Used to be, even back when I started in 2006, horror had a bad name. It's a really bad name. Because more people watch movies than read books, and people, because they're movie watchers, tend to think that horror is torture porn and misogyny and slashers and all that stuff, because those were most of the movies in the 70s and 80s and 90s. In the 2000s, we had the torture porn like Hostel and Saw and so on. I am not a fan of those genres, and a lot of people weren't either, so horror became conflated with that kind of thing, with horror extreme, transgressive theme elements, and so on. But then, in the 2000s, we got The Walking Dead, we got American Horror Story, we got, late 1990s, early 2000s, we had Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel. We had all these different elements of horror on TV that legitimized horror for the mainstream, that made horror a little easier to digest, to accept. And now horror has become such a big thing. Because of the success of some of those early shows, especially Buffy and Angel, we got Laurel Hamilton's career, we got Scott Smith who did The Ruins, Guillermo del Toro and Chuck Hogan did Strain, Justin Cronin did The Passage, Max Brooks did World War Z. Suddenly, all these horror books are living at the top of the bestseller list, legitimizing horror. Then we got the movies, all of these James Wan and all these other horror movies, Insidious and so on, that are just blowing up out there. Horror is now a big word, a good word, in all forms of publishing, and in Hollywood. Hollywood is constantly looking for the next horror IP. Constantly, constantly, constantly. And the horror IPs that are selling are the ones that's not the straight traditional horror story, but it's something else. Chapelwaite, historical horror, a midnight mass, small town isolationist horror, but also with a non-conventional vampire type. So, which may or may not have been supernatural, may not have been science fiction. Walking Dead is science fiction horror because it actually is not. It's not supernatural, you know. So all of these shows have elements that would draw in multiple potential readership groups. IP is king right now, and they're looking for the next thing. And they, as I said before, they don't care whether it's traditionally or independently published. They care that it's something that they could build a show out of. I did an anthology with George Romero a couple of years ago on zombie stories, set around Night of the Living Dead. MGM is optioning that as an Epics TV series. But interesting, they picked one of the stories from the anthology that is so not a standard zombie story, about guys living on the International Space Station, looking down at Earth as it's turning into the zombie apocalypse and knowing they're trapped up there. Orbital Decay by David Wellington. They're building a show around that. It sounds science fiction, and it is, but it's also horror. And it's going to pull in the science fiction crowd, which is also getting really big, and it's going to pull in the horror crowd. Cross-genre is what sells because we have seen so many versions of the standard model. Start adding another element in. I mean, look what they did with the Riverdale show. You know, the Archie comics turned into a murder mystery show. I didn't see that coming at all. You know, I thought the Archie, when I actually sat down to watch Riverdale, hadn't read any of the reviews, I'm thinking, this is kind of cool, an Archie show, it's going to be funny, and like, what now? And I was hooked. It was great. And some of the other shows that I love watching are ones that, again, twist the model. So, if you don't think you can invest the time to write horror novels that are multi-genre, write horror short stories that are multi-genre, or pitch to any of the comic book companies. I wouldn't go to DC and Marvel because they're closed shops now. A lot of the comic book companies are looking for anyone to pitch to them horror, and especially the genre of science fiction horror, you know, Alien, Event Horizon, that sort of thing, because they make great comics. They're not looking for superhero comic pitches. They're looking for horror. They're looking for mystery with horror elements, even if those horror elements turn out to be, you know, not like Hound of the Baskervilles, not really a monster. They're looking for things that kind of suggest that could draw it in. They're looking for romance that has, I mean, one of the biggest, most popular romance shows is Outlander. Science fiction, time travel, romance, and adventure, right? It's not just, you know, romance. It has all the other elements, and historical fiction as well. That's where the money is right now. And if you do short stories with this, and I'm running short on time here, doing short stories with this, what I recommend is try to get them in anthologies, because more of people in Hollywood are looking at anthologies than magazines right now. Some magazines. I know Weird Tales, we're getting a lot of looks from Hollywood. Jordan Peele's about to pick up one of the stories from Weird Tales. But anthologies do it because the marquee names on the cover usually sell it. That draws the attention of whoever's assistant in Hollywood is tasked with reading these things, and they start looking at the story that is unusual enough. And often, the bigger marquee names are not the ones writing the stories that are taking creative risks. You guys are. You guys are the ones who don't feel the need to conform to what traditional publishing asks, so you're taking greater risks. Those risks will make your story shine brighter. And that's fun. Now, since we're almost out of time, as with the previous classes, if you have any questions, and clearly we don't have time for questions now because I talked too long, I'll be around all day. I'll be around tomorrow. If you want to take my business card, you can also either email me or text me a question. The only question you'll get a no on is, will you read my book? Because I don't have time. But if you have writing questions about this topic or genuinely any topic, if you send me an email with 20 books in there, I will answer your question. If you send me a message through Facebook Messenger and say, you know, I was that one of your talks at 20 books, I will definitely answer your question. Because, and I'm going to run over just 2 seconds on this, I promise it won't be long. Even in traditional publishing, we want more books out there. We don't care those of us who are writing in this don't care whether traditional or indie. We want more good books out there because that will attract more readers overall, and all of publishing in all of its aspects will rise. So we want you to be as successful as possible, have as much fun, make as much money, be in the same playground and play with the same toys we're playing with. So anyway, thank you guys very much, and hope you're having a great time here at 20 Books.